Our guest speaker tonight, though, is Professor Nancy Campbell. Now, Nancy is the department head in the Department of Sciences and Technology Studies at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She is a historian of science, technology, and medicine who focuses on legal and illegal drugs, drug science, policy, treatment, harm reduction, and gender and addiction. Her most recent book, OD, Naloxone and the Politics of Overdose, was released by MIT Press in 2020, just earlier this year, right before the pandemic. Nancy also studies the ethics of human subjects research, social movements, and the fruitful convergence between neuroscience and addiction research. She's published 2 works on gender, titled Gendering Addiction, The Politics of Drug Treatment in a Neurochemical World, and her first book, Using Women, Gender, Drug Policy, and Social Justice, published in 2000, the prior published in 2011. Dr. Campbell also co-authored a visual history of the Federal Drug Treatment Program Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, titled The Narcotic Farm, The Rise and Fall of America's First Prison for Drug Addicts in 2008, and also appeared in a 2007 documentary, The Narcotic Farm. And she often speaks on radio shows about the relevance of this project to current drug treatment. Nancy's book on the history of the formative science conducted by the laboratory at the Narcotic Farm is titled Discovering Addiction, The Science and Politics of Substance Abuse Research, published in 2007. In 2009, she received the Media Award from the College on Problems of Drug Dependence for her work on the history of the science of addiction research and treatment. On a personal note, Nancy is the chair for many of my colleagues and friends from the Science and Technology Studies Department at RPI. I hang out with a lot of those folks. Their work has actually inspired a lot of our work. I think in some ways our work has sometimes inspired their work. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for coming tonight and speaking to us. We really look forward to it.
It is my pleasure, and hopefully all those students will get their dissertations written. Let's go. All right. So overdose deaths are preventable deaths, and they are deaths that have been reshaped in our lifetimes. Yet now we're in a situation where harm reduction's first tenet, never use alone, is pressured by COVID-19. Here in Troy, New York, as David mentioned, we've already had 60 overdose deaths this year, 50 since the pandemic. Our county public health department launched an Naloxone Now coaster campaign. You can get it curbside delivery 8 years after the Rensselaer County Sheriff's Department was one of the first in the country to start carrying it. But tonight is not just about naloxone. It's about overdose, and it's about why it had to take so many more lives than it should have before we started getting naloxone out. Naloxone is a very old drug. It's a 60-year-old drug that was approved to reverse overdose 50 years ago. Tonight, what I want to try to do is bring to life the changing historical contexts in which these deaths have occurred since the mid-1800s, and I'm going to compress that story, don't worry. I won't go on too long. Opioids have bedeviled societies in the global north and south since the 1805 synthesis of morphine. Medically necessary for pain, diarrheal diseases like cholera and typhoid, dental problems, respiratory illnesses, morphine was used for everything from cough syrups to sleep aids during industrial modernization. War, aging, cancer, occupational injury from mining and railroads, all of these promoted opioid use. And those users hardly sat around getting high all day. Although addiction was a term that was very little used in the United States until the turn of the 20th century, once the label addict was applied, it stuck to those deemed most deviant and slid right off the functional, professional, respectable. The US, though, has been the world's most voracious consumer of these poisons and panaceas. Poisoning deaths were very common in the 19th century, and they were chalked up to the errors of pharmacists or misbegotten children running errands for mothers, ignorant of the power of the drugs they used to soothe infants and themselves. In 1854, an editorial appeared in the New York Times damning physicians' illegible, eternally illegible handwriting, railing against nonchalant pharmacists, allowing ignorant clerks free hand in translating the mystic language of recipes scrawled in no language recognized by living or dead. You might notice that I will use the language that was used in these sources. So in this case, criminal charges were filed in the death of Mrs. Webster, a Gowanus wife and mother who dispatched one of her 9 children to her preferred South Brooklyn drugstore. The hapless child reported that her mother was in great bodily pain. Familiar with Mrs. Webster's usual dose, the druggist, a Scot with 30 years' experience, packaged up 2 grains of morphine. After taking the full supply, Mrs. Webster lingered in a comatose state and expired the next day. Jailed after that event, the druggist, Robert Kennedy, was arraigned. Overdoses were typically reported as deaths from natural causes, unless suicide was expected or murder. Conflicting sympathies made the Brooklyn jury unable to render a verdict in Mrs. Webster's case in 1868. Most of the jurors wanted to acquit Kennedy, only 2 to convict. The pharmacist pointed out Mrs. Webster's extreme suffering, insisting that he meant her to take just 1/6 to 1/3 of a grain at a time until she obtained relief. The hung jury yielded no satisfaction for Mr. Webster. Left to provide for 9 young children, he was later awarded the maximum amount of damages allowed in a civil case, $5,000. So sleep and suicide were the main reasons people self-administered excessive amounts of morphine. And as early as the 1880s, scorn was heaped on dangerous folk remedies used as antidotes for poisoning. Mistakes as to the quantity of opium preparations are by no means uncommon, opined a newspaper columnist advising what should be done in the cases of poisonings at home. Castigating mothers who gave poison to babies without doctor's advice, the column instructed readers to count the victim's breaths, and if they fell below 10 breaths a minute, it will require all the skill that can be obtained to combat death. Walking the person around or slapping them with wet towels were cast as outdated customs in 1880. Yet the more up-to-date recommendations will raise your eyebrows. If physical stimulant is to be used, lay the patient on a bed or lounge and slap with the back of a hairbrush or a slipper. This is all the nursing necessary, so long as breathing keeps above 10 to the minute. The article advised artificial respiration if breathing slowed and offered rapid diagnostic tests to ascertain if opium was the culprit. Observe the narrowing of the pupil to a small circle, which does not enlarge in the dark. Practical advice for preventing accidental poisonings included keeping medicines in a locked cabinet. Many poisons followed the term overdose in this era: aconite, antimony, arsenic, belladonna, strychnine, iodine, potassium cyanide, chloroform, chlorohydrate, ether, oil of tansy, valerian, carbolic acid, anodyne, mercury, quinine. These nostrums were self-administered for bronchial afflictions, diarrhea, pain, insomnia, toothache, delirium tremens. The line between self-medication, murder, and suicide was very blurry. Disputes between prescribing physicians, dispensing druggists, and families of the deceased ensued. The causes ran from temporary insanity to mental derangement to lack of success in business or love. But the overriding question was it accident or design? Police and physicians were summoned to overdose events and were sometimes able to counteract them by relieving individuals of the poison, pumping stomachs, inducing vomiting, administering enemas, In one case, the police reportedly administered a lamp oil enema to good effect. Infant poisonings were considered lamentable accidents caused by ignorant mothers. Bank presidents, school teachers, businessmen, accountants, physicians, and nurses, many suffering neuralgia, died of overdose, and news of their deaths came by mail and telegraph, an eclectic listing of everything from upcoming frost to saloon brawls to occupational injury. Deaths from overdose were listed with very little comment and a brief reason, taken to quiet his nerves after a spree. Overdoses of brandy or whiskey were listed, and one death was even attributed to an overdose of water. Mistakes happened. Drinking a bottle of laudanum thinking it was cough syrup, or reusing a bottle that had held a more potent poison. A Madison Avenue teenager died after drinking a bottle of morphine that he mistook for quinine prescribed for malaria. Then, in 1898, Bayer released aspirin and heroin. The latter was sniffed rather than injected in the 1910s and 20s. Risk of needle-borne diseases, including the malaria outbreak in New York City from 1933 to 43, increased with the uptake of the needle. Although few owned their own syringes, injection remained uncommon prior to the 30s and did not become popular until after World War II. A cluster of deaths among white women, vaudeville performers, occurred in early 1922. Burlesque performers Dorothy, Wardell, and Dixie Dixon, part of a drug smuggling ring operating out of the Montreal Actors Club, reportedly died of heroin poisoning in the back of a New York City taxicab. They conveyed small satchels of dope to Canada and brought back large trunks of intoxicating liquors. Well-off white women were known as opium vampires in the Roaring Twenties. Miss Mary Brown Warburton, granddaughter of department store magnate John Wanamaker, which everyone in Philadelphia knows, died in her Park Avenue apartment, which included large quantities of an opium derivative. An array of remedies appeared at the time: alcohol, ammonia, amyl nitrate, atropine, which was long considered an antagonist to opium but is not one, boiling water, caffeine, camphor, capsicum per rectum, carbon dioxide, catharsis, cocaine, cold, chloramine, digitalis, dilation of the anal sphincter, electricity, epinephrine, ether, exercise, flagellation, gastric lavage, hot baths, iodine, lemon juice, milk intravenously, nitroglycerin, olive oil, oxygen, permanganate, picrotoxin, saline enemas, strychnine, a stimulant, tannin, tea, tobacco, tracheotomy, turpentine, vinegar, inhalation of water vapor. Pain itself was thought antagonistic to morphine. A Wisconsin physician advocated severe pain for treatment of overdose. Let the physician remember that the real antidote to opium is pain, and as far as known, there is no other. This assumption that pain made people immune to addiction helped cast chronic pain patients and terminally ill people as dependent on opiates to which they could not get addicted. The deaths from narcotism, as it was also called, ticked steadily upward in Chicago in the late 1940s and early 50s. Due to the dominance of the drug control apparatus and the approach taken by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the FBN, they said the problem was nefarious pushers. But the father of Chicago teenager Tommy Gordon demanded an explanation from the FBN for his son's death in 1947. So the agents tapped into Tommy's network of high school heroin injectors to investigate the last moments of his life. It wasn't his first overdose. Realizing Tommy was over and out again, his friends iced his temples and groin, force-fed him milk. As the FBN gathered details, none conformed to the prevailing narrative in which a dealer supplied heroin to an unsuspecting youth in order to hook him. Instead, heroin use was influenced, according to the FBN, by adolescent desire to be part of the hip new happening thing. The first narcotic antagonist, a drug named Naline or Nalorphine, was found in the 1940s to be a therapeutic agent in the treatment of narcotic poisoning. Two Navy physicians considered the advent of an effective antidote of signal importance. They urged it be made available in antidote kits. It wasn't. At Cook County Hospital in Chicago, heroin overdose occurred often enough that cases overflowed into corridors. When Ed Domino was a resident, they'd ventilate them periodically and give them picrotoxin, a convulsive, to try and stimulate respiration. It really didn't work. Sometimes there were so many heroin ODs, there wasn't enough people to ventilate them. You'd have to make a decision of triage. Who are you going to let die, and who are you going to let live? So decades later, Dr. Domino recounted accidentally overdosing an elderly woman with breast cancer. Her pupils were constricted. She wasn't breathing, and a nurse was bagging her, which is what is shown in this medical advertisement. He and a friend had been demonstrating the pharmacological concept of narcotic antagonism to med students by awakening dogs overdosed on morphine. He called for some and gave it to her intravenously. And you wouldn't believe what happened. First thing you know, she's breathing like a train. She wakes up, opens her eyes. Before, her pupils were constricted, but now they're dilated. She looks at me and she says, "Hi, Dr. Domino." She lived for a while longer, and then she transferred to a nursing home and died. But after that event, the nurses thought I was God. The attending couldn't believe it. I was known as the professor. That's when I became a pharmacologist, then and there. Comatose, when police brought her to a Brooklyn hospital at 10:35 p.m. on May 1st, 1953, a well-developed, well-nourished, light-skinned mulatto woman had reportedly been injected with heroin 4 hours before. When her breathing slowed and she turned blue, her friends got scared and called the police, who took her to the hospital. Placed on a ventilator, she was removed when she appeared to be lifeless, manually resuscitated, and administered Nalorphine, Naline. Within 1 minute, the patient started to breathe, her pupils dilated, and she rapidly became conscious and sat up. She then became belligerent. Described as quarrelsome, confused, and somewhat somnolent, the patient related that this episode was her first exposure to heroin. Heroin settled into urban neighborhoods in the mid-50s. Police were incentivized to enforce the first mandatory minimums, which went into effect in 1951, but they had trouble telling who was a narcotic addict. Harris Isbell, director of the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, offered a solution in 1954. Police could use Nalorphine to detect who was an addict. This first diagnostic test for opioid addiction caused a non-addict's pupils to constrict and an addict's pupils to dilate. California legislators had criminalized both the act of consuming narcotics and the condition of being an addict. Putting Naline to work in the Oakland Vice Squad was the idea of Dr. James Terry, who standardized dosage and a technique for measuring pupil size. The FBN urged local law enforcement to adopt Naline as a tool of scientific policing. And by the early 60s, vice squads from Eureka to LA had done so. Nalorphine intensified abstinence. Effects varied. Some people felt really drowsy, like whiskey or barbiturates, and other people were anxiously plagued with vividly disturbing daydreams or visual hallucinations. Higher doses produced uncontrollable thoughts racing through the head, so subjects nicknamed it Climaline, after a commercial cleaning fluid that cleans you out of dope and makes you climb the walls. The goal of the Naline program was to detect and isolate those who have been using narcotics so that enforced abstinence and treatment can be provided and control measures instigated. The Vice Squad photographed injection sites, track marks, sclerotic veins, crude tattoos used in a feeble attempt to hide the telltale scars, and labeled them with typed ID numbers and dates. There are hundreds of these photographs. The Vice Squad saw an unnatural taste for euphoria as the main motivation for drug use. Intensity of euphoria may diminish, but it is always present. There would be no point in continuing the use of narcotics if the injection simply made the addict feel normal. It is the normalcy to which he objects. Naloxone control units in Southern California saw the test as a therapeutic crutch. In Pasadena, the first Southern California community to adopt it, the technology was made familiar as a hound dog drug that can sniff out the narcotics user. Triumphant pronouncements were made all the time about the Naloxone program's deterrent effects. So let me tell you the story of Lawrence Robinson. On a chilly Los Angeles night in early 1960, narcotics officers on Wilshire Boulevard pulled over a car and inspected the occupants' arms and pupils with flashlights. The backseat passenger was a 25-year-old African-American Army veteran, Lawrence Robinson, who exhibited purported nervousness and perspiration when ordered to bare his arms. The officers noticed track marks and charged him with suspicion of being a narcotics user under California's Health and Safety Code. He spent the next months in jail. A jury convicted him that summer after examining his arms with a magnifying glass. The jury was instructed to convict Mr. Robinson even if it found no proof of actual use of narcotics by him, so long as it found him an addict. Placed on probation for 2 years, Robinson was required to submit periodically for the Naloxone test. His mother got him a lawyer who argued his case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Lawrence v. Robinson, 1962, is considered a watershed precedent on Eighth Amendment rights to be free of cruel and unusual punishment. That was his lawyer's argument. Cold turkey was cruel and unusual punishment for the condition of addiction. And the lawyer assured the Supreme Court that his client remained on probation and subject to the Naloxone testing program. Proclaimed beneath headlines like "Drug Addiction Ruled No Crime," the case still stands as a watershed in decriminalization of status crimes. But Lawrence Robinson had neither leprosy nor a common cold. Naloxone tests had not deterred him from using. He died of an overdose in an alley on August 5th, 1961, 10 months before the Supreme Court rendered its opinion. His lawyer either gave a credible performance of not knowing his client was dead or was genuinely unaware. According to the New York City Office of the Medical Examiner, which was the only office that had articulated criteria in how to certify an overdose death, 3,200 overdose deaths occurred between 1950 and 1964, 2/3 after 1957. Overdose was portrayed as a Negro problem in New York. The ratio of African American to white deaths was 12-1. New York suppliers served users from Baltimore to Philly to DC as heroin became an organizing force around which whole lives centered. The typical addict of that era, according to anthropologists Preble and Casey, was a very busy man, a hustler, taking care of business. Disrupted by World War II and post-war criminalization and crackdowns by law enforcement, mid-20th century drug markets reorganized. Social relations within them deteriorated. Day-to-day risks of death and violence increased during a heroin shortage or panic that waxed and waned from 1961 to 1968. Prices skyrocketed, demand rose, dealers responded with short counts and adulteration. Trust, needless to say, declined. Hustling displaced all other meaningful pursuits. Social cohesion and emotional identification gave way to a loose association of individuals and parallel couples. Karen and Johnny, pseudonyms, were habitués of Needle Park at 71st and Broadway. See if you can find them in that photo. In private, they lived frenzied lives, as depicted in this photo of Karen tying off, her holding a tourniquet in her teeth with the fixity of an animal about to tear into its prey. A very competent dope fiend and sex worker, Karen had a knack for reviving people from overdose, and in a riveting series of photographs, photographer Bill Epridge caught her reviving a trick who had shot up heroin on top of taking 5 Doriden pills. The photographs attest to a familiarity with overdose, as Karen matter-of-factly went about a sequence of actions that ended up reviving her client. This spread appeared in Life magazine in early 1965 and was one of the first visual characterizations of overdose to ever appear in mainstream media. The story centered Karen's expertise and was unusual in portraying overdose as survivable and a matter of know-how. That year, a Signet paperback, which described Karen and Johnny as Romeo and Juliet on junk, acknowledged that her brilliance was widely recognized in the treatment of OD, a shot that unexpectedly contains more heroin than the body can survive. She always knew what to do about an overdose. She was compared to a doctor or even the medical examiner who had seen quite a few bodies disposed of, tossed out windows, hauled into alleys, dragged down staircases. She knew that almost every day in New York City, a junkie dies of an overdose. Depicted with unmistakably maternal affect, Karen was a medic willing to tend to her fallen comrades while others went about taking care of their own business. Their story appeared on the big screen as Panic in Needle Park, and they remind us how heroin use has been continually depicted as historically new in white communities. Despite whites being the predominant racial ethnic group with access to opioids since the 19th century, surprise is a long-term feature of overdose stories in middle-class white communities, whereas overdose in communities of color has an aura of inevitability and fatality about it. The New York Times started publishing a running total of children who OD'd in 1969, when 1/4 of the 800 overdose deaths in New York City occurred in children. Weeks after turning 12, Walter Vandermeer died a death that transformed him from just another kid running loose in the Harlem ghetto to a notable statistic as the youngest person ever to die of overdose. That's him, the second one in the city of New York to that point. Walter was 4'11", an 80-pound innocent wearing a Snoopy shirt who died in a bathroom on a Sunday morning, his mother's bathroom, with injection equipment at his side. If Walter was indeed an addict pusher, as he was portrayed, his injection technique was impeccable. His body, quote, bore no marks from unclean needles. The medical examiner still considered it possible he had been addicted to heroin for 2 years prior. The harms of drug trafficking and consumption have been disproportionately borne by communities of color since then. Walter Vandermeer joined the many reports that effectively normalized heroin in Harlem, making overdose more expected than aberrant. Antoinette Dishman died after sniffing heroin at a party in the Bronx, or inhaling it, it's not clear. An honor student from Chicago, she had lived in a Barnard dormitory with other Black women, and she counted Black militants among her friends. A week before she died, Dishman participated in a 4-day sit-in at St. Luke's Hospital in Harlem. The goal, which succeeded, was to get a medically assisted detox and treatment program for adolescent heroin addicts. Portrayed as an innocent, a needless waste of a young life, Dishman was always described, and this was a widely covered case, as pretty, bright, young, and militant, and Black. Part of a citywide moral panic about heroin use among young people from communities of color, reported under headlines such as "Herd Instinct Turns the Young to Heroin." Her case was used as proof of heroin's power, and her suppliers were charged with homicide, first ones. The apartment she died in was said to be a regular factory for the packaging of narcotics for sale. By 1970, drug deaths were the single greatest cause of death in adolescents in the city of New York, exceeding deaths from accidents, suicide, homicide, and even natural disease. But 80% of those deaths were not just from heroin. They involved mixtures of everything under the sun. Nor was overdose uncommon elsewhere. In North Carolina, Regina Whittington, a High Point Enterprise reporter, began a 1973 story thus: "Once upon a time, a very long time ago, when little boys wanted to be presidents, when they grew up and little girls aspired to be no more than mommies, High Point did not have a drug problem. Everyone knew, of course, that somewhere there existed certain persons who were crazed, insane fugitives from justice who were addicts, but no one knew them. And they certainly weren't in High Point. But it is no longer once upon a time, and the pages of storybooks and fictions can offer nothing to explain the reality of High Point's drug society today." That was 1973. In 1972, High Point Memorial Hospital reported 200 overdoses to police and had begun directly admitting those who had overdosed into hospital-based treatment, and which is recognized today as an innovation, by the way. An ER nurse was quoted, "You don't build or help people by destroying them. An overdose is an indication of trouble." In 2014, High Point again experienced a rash of overdoses, more than 100, including 14 deaths, attributed to its always having been a traditional supply point along a heroin pipeline. The fact that there were twice as many ODs in 1972 as in 2014 seemed to have been forgotten, as many things about overdose have been. So in the early 1970s, overdose was literally everywhere. Endo Labs on Long Island, the company for which naloxone had been synthesized in the early 1960s, took it through the FDA approval process in 1971 for opioid reversal. But they didn't see much of a market for it. They didn't push it, so gradually it leaked into emergency medicine, even though naloxone was a far cleaner and better drug than Naline or Nalorphine in its effects. Dr. Sid Schnall describes setting up a drug testing facility at the Philadelphia Folk Festival, right around the time that naloxone became available. It wasn't experimental anymore, but it was actually out, so I brought some to the folk festival, and they brought in this young woman who had overdosed on heroin. She was blue. She was dead. We pumped her full of naloxone, and she woke up. It was amazing. A lot of the staff around there had never seen it before. I didn't want to keep her there, so I sent her out to a local hospital, and I sent Narcan along with her because I didn't even know if the hospital had it. 2 or 3 years later, I was asked to be on a TV show in the Philadelphia area talking about drug abuse. And after I was interviewed, this young woman comes up to me and she says, "Dr. Schnall, yeah, I am sure you don't know me, but remember the person who overdosed on heroin at the Philadelphia Folk Festival? You saved my life, and I never got a chance to thank you. So I'm thanking you now." So even in a city with a venerable and visible heroin-using population, naloxone was unevenly available in the mid-70s. Just because a drug is approved doesn't mean it gets where it needs to go. Why did it take tens of thousands of opioid-related overdose deaths annually before a movement arose to put naloxone in the hands of those who needed it most? So remember the 80s, dominated by AIDS. Activists were propelled to set up illegal needle exchanges because there were paraphernalia laws. With the advent of retrovirals, antiretrovirals, HIV became survivable and overdose visible. But harm reduction remained a dirty word at the federal, state, and local level in the Just Say No United States. So toward the end of the 90s, naloxone began to be portrayed by the movement as a tool to directly challenge death. Santa Cruz Needle Exchange, which these illustrations I'm going to show you came from, founded a zine called Junk Food. The first issue included Narcan Doesn't Have to Fuck You Up, which was written by a paramedic who claimed to have fixed more ODs than I can count, and who argued that Narcan doesn't kill people. It doesn't even make them sick. The way that it's given is what makes the difference between gently waking someone up and jolting them into projectile vomiting, shaking, cold sweating hell. Adopting scientific lingo, he characterized heroin as a vehicle for getting morphine molecules to your brain. When you OD, the synapses in your brain are flooded with morphine molecules. Too much morphine stops the brain from telling you to breathe, a signal to call paramedics who could administer oxygen, support the airway, and give naloxone if they get there in time. He said, we can give it slowly in little bits. First you start breathing, and then after a little more you wake up. Or we can slam a huge amount. We can just as easily keep you substantially stoned as wake you up like a fluorescent light bulb. Our job is to save your life. We're not there to teach you a lesson or make you feel like cat shit. We can do our job with compassion, or we can do it with hate. Unfortunately, you don't get to interview us before you OD, and you can't pick your favorite paramedic when the time comes. The truth is that saving your life with Narcan is easy. Doing it compassionately takes a little sophistication. The Oxygen Project, as SCNE dubbed it, liberated naloxone and attracted attention from the nascent national organizing around harm reduction. Heather Edney, one of the founders of SCNE Junk Food, titled one of her columns, User versus Addict/Abuser, reflecting on disrespectful labels that trapped drug users. She wrote, the language of addict and abuser leaves no room for everything else that I could be as a drug user. That language leaves me with no words to talk about my drug use. I will never be able to learn from that type of language. Junk food offered ways out of that trap. This kind of vintage science fiction imagery, rocket ships and robots and astronauts. These were the first overdose education prevention materials. So even though we had narcotic antagonists all this time, it took harm reduction activists to get overdose prevention on the agenda by early 2000. Needle exchanges in San Francisco and Chicago and New York were doing naloxone administration training and helping young injectors develop overdose plans to protect themselves and educate each other and reduce drug-related harm within the community. Activists started obtaining and supplying naloxone, reframing experiences of life and death. From Chicago Recovery Alliance, Dan Bigg channeled mourning for his friend, John Seiler, who'd overdosed in May 1996, into organizing a national distribution hub for naloxone that would be illegal over the next 2 decades until his own death from overdose in 2017. So going from this decidedly DIY culture to the public health harm reduction infrastructure we have today took a lot of pragmatic work by a very decentralized movement. First media mentions of naloxone was Heroin Hassles, which appeared in the Village Voice, written by Maya Zalovitz in early 2000. It described early harm reduction efforts, including those in Italy, where naloxone was over the counter. The popular culture of overdose prevention has been produced almost entirely by the harm reduction movement itself, with a few mainstream mentions, like Trainspotting in 1996, Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, 1994, a film that was credited by many harm reduction activists with inspiring their action, and Martin Scorsese's Bringing Out the Dead in 1999. The latter contained a Narcan revival scene set in a nightclub. So it was really only 5 years ago, 2015, that obituaries began to mention overdose, an event so newsworthy, the mentioning of overdose in obituaries, that there was reporting and blogging about the explicit naming of the cause of death. So I suspect that there were many overdoses in history that we'll never identify as overdoses. Popular representations of vigils, parents, harm reduction groups giving out naloxone, wishing they'd had it before their son or daughter died, and public art projects received a lot more play in public space. The new visibility of overdose still emphasized the acute episode, the young, the white, the once promising, the socially redeemable, but above all, the beloved. These are the portraits that are continually rehung in the National Gallery of the Opioid Crisis. So when I attended Troy Foundry Theatre's production and Simpatico Theatre's production of The Shadow That Broke the Light, it reminded me how far overdose had literally permeated the fabric of American life. People now know naloxone. In bringing to life overdose deaths across time, we have to ask, what if people had known about naloxone from 1960 on? What if it had been on hand? What if it had been where it should have been? As harm reduction educator Lee Hertel says, nobody deserves to die because of how they choose to navigate life. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. That was great. That was great. So we're going to move into a portion of tonight's program. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A. So there is a Q&A. I'm just looking at my notes here. You can feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom or chat if you can't find that. In the meantime, while we wait for folks to load in their questions, I'll ask Nancy the first question. And so Nancy, I know, and really bravo, wonderful. There was so much interesting, compelling stuff that I had no idea about. In the meantime, I'll ask you the first question. I know from your experience in your discipline, and for those of you who don't know, it is science and technology and society, or science and technology studies, depending on which school you go to, I guess. I know that your discipline is concerned with examining science, technology, and innovation as they shape and or are shaped by their social, political, cultural, and economic contexts. And we've obviously learned a lot over the last 150 years. But why do we as a society, this might be a little bit of a broad question, so you feel free to carve it down, but why do we as a society, in spite of the expanding recognition of harm reduction and how it can help, why do we continue to nearly collectively ignore this issue? I know some of it is the stigma of addiction, but it feels like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think there's more to it. I was struck by the waves of historical amnesia that I ran into, where each generation, different things about overdose were discovered. So I do think that there is something about our lack of recognition that stigma does, in a sense, right, keep us trapped within a very moralizing kind of economy in which it's very difficult for people to admit to using. And there's also very little recognition, right? Some of those other unrecognized overdoses are in chronic pain patients and people who are using opioids according to medical direction. And so many overdoses, particularly of pharmaceutical opioids, are when they are being used as prescribed. And what struck me as surprising was that family and friends don't realize that whenever anyone is on high dose opioids, you need to have naloxone on hand because the stigma was that strong. I've had physicians tell me, I did a lot of work talking with physicians who prescribe opioids and who study them. And I've had physicians tell me that they co-prescribe naloxone when they prescribe high-dose opioids because they suspect that many of their patients who have, quote, elderly patients, terminally ill patients who have, quote, died in their sleep, actually died of opioid overdose. And so when a stigma is that strong that we cannot recognize our realities and we refuse to recognize the realities of the people around us, it's held in place by law, by policy, by drug policy, which has effectively fueled mass incarceration. It's in other words, it's infrastructural, right? It's invisible, but it holds us in place. So it is very difficult for us to recognize, to the point even where medically assisted treatment, MAT, with buprenorphine or with methadone is called an addiction rather than recognized as therapeutic. And so, yeah, we have so many cultural contradictions around the use of opioids that it just makes it very difficult for us to see what we really should be doing. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, the historical sort of amnesia is really something that we experience in so many other ways as well. I'm going to hand it over to Emily because Emily's going to field the questions for us from our audience tonight. So take it away, Emily.
So my first, not my question, but the first question is, hi, Nancy, can you give some context response to two opposing movements surrounding naloxone? On one side, we see some counties and school districts training kids as young as 6 in using Narcan to reduce overdose deaths. And in other places, we see sheriffs publicly announcing that they will not respond to repeat overdoses to administer Narcan because it is a drain on resources. Can you give some context to those two opposing movements?
Yeah, there in 2017 or so, there began to be a lot of reporting around what were called Narcan parties. This idea. So one of the things about naloxone is that there is a vast amount of evidence that was produced by this movement, by this harm reduction activist movement, and researchers who were allied with it to show that people don't actually do that. They don't actually use more or use in a more risky way. Just as you don't probably drive in a more risky way if you're wearing a seatbelt than if you're not, if naloxone is around, right? So there began to be quite a bit of pushback around naloxone from law enforcement in particular, and this business about the naloxone parties began to be reported. And this was a made up story, right? This was fake news, it circulated, and yet you'll have law enforcement who swear that they have come upon a naloxone party, or that they don't want to give there's even an acronym for it, MNA, multiple naloxone administrations. So there are movements to restrict naloxone in places where people might overdose more than once. And oftentimes people do overdose more than once because it's a problem of supply. It's a problem of the fact that since 2013, fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid that doesn't have to have poppies grown at the base of it, has been, and fentanyl has accounted for a large increase in overdose death. Particularly almost all of the African American rise in overdose deaths since 2013 has been accounted for by fentanyl, which is not always just in opioids, but is also in stimulants like cocaine or meth. And so this these are problems of supply and problems of illegal supply and illegal trafficking. So these oppositions have been set up in part because public health departments are purchasing naloxone and are distributing naloxone, and some people who are either fiscally or culturally conservative do not like that because they do not think that public resources should be extended to drug users. People are using drugs, that's their choice, they might say, libertarian arguments, right? So these are conflicts that are occurring in public space that are very much about what we were just talking about, right? The problem of moral economy underpinned by stigma. The other fact about naloxone that people don't often realize is that, look, this was a generic drug. It was an old drug. It was a cheap drug. But now pharmaceutical companies are price gouging, and they are raising the price of naloxone so that it is much less affordable than it used to be. And that's part of this story, right? So I know some folks who are trying to create a much cheaper naloxone so that school districts and public health departments can afford to buy, and harm reduction activists can afford to buy it. And so there's a place where we really do need innovation, but we haven't had much innovation. I mean, the pharmaceutical company that should have put naloxone on the market a lot before it did, did not recognize that innovation was needed in this sector. And of course, that's something that we now know. But it's one of those kind of it's sometimes being a historian is hard, because you just want to say, why didn't people just do something when they could have? But no, they don't, because again, that underpinning, that law, those laws and policies, paraphernalia was illegal. Naloxone was illegal. I know people who were arrested for carrying naloxone. It was considered a sign that you were a heroin addict. And so, there had to be, in every single state, changes in law, naloxone access laws and Good Samaritan laws, so that people would use naloxone, because they would not be, charged themselves. So there had to be all these changes in order for naloxone to enter the scene and become what it has today.
Can I make a quick comment? Because I'm really, there's a lot in there that you said that I think is really important. I just want to unpack a little bit of that. Like, the first thing is, obviously we know the naloxone party idea was total bullshit. It doesn't have, but the point is even if it does happen, the police don't get to make the decision to not fucking go there and do their jobs. So that's really important. And I also know too, like through my research, that at least in my town, many of the police officers don't want to carry Narcan. Some of them show up and they don't use it. And that happens, so that's one part of it that I think is important, is like, even if those stigma inducing stories are true, they don't get to just make that decision. That's out of their hands. So why are we allowing them to continue, to make that decision? I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, and lack of accountability around that is also interesting, Adam, because there used to be overuse of naloxone and Narcan. So that paramedic in Santa Cruz who was talking about some of his colleagues who would hit people really hard. In my book, I also talk about Glasgow. The book is partly about UK, because Scotland also has had a real problem with drug-related deaths, and there it was documented, right, that medical providers were hitting people really hard in the ER in a punitive way. So it can be, so any technology, right, can be used in a beneficial way. And here's one that can be used in a beneficial way, but it can also be used in a punitive way. And I think whenever you have this kind of polarized, punitive, moralistic kind of concept, oh, those dirty druggies. I mean, this is the reason I do this work. I grew up with that attitude. I felt it. And it's a very pernicious and very common attitude, right? That these people are wasting their lives. And so why should we extend, why should law enforcement, why should ER docs, why should we extend to people, or why, even bystanders right now can carry naloxone, and yet there is this sort of morality, right, that really locks people in place. And just as you said, no accountability for how and what the police are doing with naloxone. We were lucky in this area. The Rensselaer County Sheriff's Department in 2012 was one of the first, right? Doesn't that seem like not so long ago, 2012, to be one of the first sheriff's departments to carry naloxone? And that was because there was a rural white high school where there had been several overdose deaths in a public restroom, and it was because of that, right? So often it is because of that, right? In many of the places in this country where there is some naloxone distribution, it's because there was a highly public overdose death, like on Boston Commons, or in a park, a famous park. And so you often have this kind of, you have to have a galvanizing event in order to get people to do the right thing.
Well, it's also too, like, not to like monopolize the conversation and ask other people trying to ask questions, but I mean, I appreciate the fact too that you're saying that we need to find alternate methods of producing naloxone that is not in the capitalist marketplace. I mean, right? Like in the 90s, they said AIDS pays. That was a common, and now in this time, the opioid overdose or epidemic pays, right? And the fact of the matter is I mean, at least as far as I know it, naloxone is cheaper to produce than sterilized water. It's the materials are available; they're there for us. And you know, companies in Pennsylvania, and Radnor is where Narcan is produced. And one of the things that Narcan that they're doing is they're giving institutions Narcan for free, but that Narcan has a 2-year shelf life. So they know that if they give an institution 100 doses of Narcan for free today, in 2 years when they need to replace that, they have to buy 200 doses of Narcan to replace what's in it. So, you know, and it's the same, not the same, but it's still, it's something I'm interested in, which gets people really worked up because buprenorphine is so important. We need it widely available. But I spent time in Johnson City, Tennessee, where those same pill mills that were pushing opioid pills are now pushing buprenorphine in the exact same way. And it's not as, I mean, it is safe, but for the pregnant women down there, which is who I was focusing on, they're being given Subutex, which doesn't have naloxone in it. So overdose deaths are happening amongst those women that are given Subutex. And a lot of that is being sold out of the parking lot, not being sold in. So we need to have it wide, but anytime I think we get to this plateau where we think we're doing the right thing, we have to also understand there's a giant undercurrent underneath that, trying to push that in the wrong direction. And I just think it's, you know, so while we talk about like buprenorphine is what we need to do, also understand there are people preying on that need, which I think we need to push buprenorphine, but we also have to understand that this like capitalist machine that has pushed all of this shit, you know, continues even with the solutions. So
Yeah, so I see Charlie wants to get in, and I just want to say, read my colleague David Hertzberg's book, White Drug Markets.
okay.
Read it all the way to the end, because I do think that there are things that we could do with the market that probably do need to happen. But I think we also have to understand, I mean, there's also a lot of clinical indications about buprenorphine. The buprenorphine is still, and methadone, but buprenorphine in particular is still, you know, a partial agonist antagonist. So you can't, you know, you're not going to die unless you are using another central nervous system depressant like a benzodiazepine or alcohol. So Charlie, you wanted to get in though.
I know we're running super long and I don't want to take away from other voices that are in the conversation right now, but I think I might speak to that a little bit. I just want to, David framed his first question to you, and you really only got one in there with like this idea of like, I know that stigma isn't the primary ... What, and then you answered his question with things that were stigma is the primary ... And Caroline wrote about this too. I feel like this might be a massive oversimplification, but I really do believe that we've just got to change our attitude around this. And that is like the major component to moving the fucking ball forward. Like we almost had Safe House here in Philly. It was this close. A safe injection harm reduction site 3 blocks from my house, right down Broad Street. It almost happened, but then the not in my backyard, fuck junkies shit came. I'm sorry. I made this much more crass. And your presentation was so beautiful. But like, I think it was Caroline's like, what? Where do you see OD stigma emanating from? Says Caroline. Well, where do we? That's the lens we need to shine on ourselves. Because David, as much as I'm like, that seems like a small part of the problem, I often wonder if that is all of the problem in its entirety.
Yeah.
And
But Charlie,
please, yeah, sorry.
no, I mean, look, the narcotic farm researchers, who are the people who produced the knowledge base around addiction, they tried to destigmatize addiction in the 50s. I cut that quote because it was like going too long. But there have been waves of people trying to destigmatize addiction and trying to replace the term addict with person who uses drugs, people who use drugs, right? Ways that are less stigmatizing languages. There have been a history of attempts to do that really from the 1950s on. There was a whole movement within the 1950s, lawyers and doctors mostly, against the FBN, against criminalization. They thought it should be a public health problem. They thought it should be thought of as a chronic disease. A chronic relapsing disease is a quote from the 1950s, not the 1990s. The brain part came especially in the 1990s, but you'd also hear that discourse back in the 1890s. And so there have been a lot of attempts, there have been a lot of changes. So while we have this amnesia, we also have had a lot of change. There does need to be more innovation because there, clearly relapse rates, being what they still are not much better now than they were in the 50s. And so we honestly do have to look. I think you're right, Charlie. I mean, I think it is very much about the market, about the division between legal and illegal drugs, about the fact that we can't make a safe market if it's an illegal market. You can't know what you're really using. Even with fentanyl test strips, you can know fentanyl's there, but you can't know how much fentanyl is there, and you can't really make an informed judgment about what to use and how to use it. And so why, with all this knowledge and all of this capacity in terms of pharmaceutical innovation, why can't we do better? Well, I think so that's why I do this kind of thing, and I think that's why you guys are doing what you're doing, right? You're trying to still. There was in the 1890s, there was a book called Drug Addicts as Human Beings, and that's what we're still doing. We're still trying to humanize. We're still trying to bring it home. We're still trying to say, it's my brother, it's my sister, it's my mother, it's my daughter. It's, we're still trying to do that at every medium we can these days. So I think, and I think we're all part of that. We're all part of that fight. We're all part of that struggle. And the fact that it's still a struggle, I showed you some of the white lightning, the stuff that was produced by people who were really trying to bring some attention to the role of pharmaceutical companies, to methadone in New York City, right? All of that from the 70s. And that's partly because I want people to take heart. There is still work to be done. We're still out there trying to inform and to change people's minds, because I think that's in the end what we have to do, change minds.
Yeah. Emily, what else we got?
So we have quite a few questions. I'm going to start with a super quick one. Where can I purchase a copy of Narcotic Farm? I looked on Amazon, but they only have used copies.
Okay, well, just wait, because the University of Kentucky Press, that was published by an art press called Abrams, and it was published in 2007 or 8, I forget, but University of Kentucky Press is going to bring out, I believe, a new edition of The Narcotic Farm, which I co-authored with J.P. Olsen and Luke Walden, who made the film. And we think that will be spring of 2021. It's best to wait for that, because the copies on the used copies on Amazon, I mean, I really should have invested in cases of it, but I didn't. And so they're really expensive. So you can see the film on Vimeo, but the book will come out again.
Great. I have a question here. Following up on the issue of cocaine and meth mixed with fentanyl, there is no equivalent of Narcan for those drugs, but the uptick in fentanyl mixed into those drugs has led to overdoses in communities that have not been targeted by naloxone-related harm reduction outreach. How can we learn from this history of harm reduction activism to prevent opioid overdoses in primarily stimulant users?
Yeah, I think
we saw raps of that in Troy too. That happened quite a
Yeah,
bit in
it
Troy
did.
recently.
It did during the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Pretty recently, a group, right. So harm reduction activists like, Prevention Point in Philly and Pittsburgh, they've been aware of this issue for a long time. And that's why the fentanyl test strips are being advocated. And they, so I think that the tools of harm reduction are changing. They'll always change, right, to kind of keep up. But I also think that the tactics of harm reduction, which are kind of, I mean, I tried to show you some really irreverent education, overdose prevention and education materials, because I do think that there's something different about the way public health departments educate about this issue in official and very often quite sterile language versus harm reduction activists, which get you in a really different way. If you're a user, right? So I think that everybody should be very aware of this at this point, that fentanyl is in the US opioid supply, pharmaceutical opiates, and in stimulants, in all illegally trafficked drugs, whether they're diverted or not. Fentanyl is it's a contaminant, right? It's an adulterant. It's everywhere. And so people really should be paying more attention to safety, no matter what it is that they're using. Whether we can learn from lessons from this kind of history. I mean, think about HIV and AIDS, which was really the movement that preceded the movement around naloxone. So I think we do learn, but I think it takes a really long time, and it always takes new users coming into the picture and deciding to take up harm reduction.
Thank you, Nancy. I have one other question here for you. If we are seeing in countries that are allowing for safe injection sites and the decriminalization of drugs, a decline in drug use and drug deaths, why hasn't this been carried over into other countries? We know it works, but we're still not doing it in this country. I get this country has a huge fear of drugs, but if we do this, we could help so many people and decrease it. Putting people in jails doesn't work.
Yeah, all of the activists who I interviewed in Scotland, for instance, they're all working on safer injection sites now. And so the problem is that our laws, policies, customs really are just say no. They're prohibition based, and they are not based in harm reduction. So although lots of people will say, oh yeah, everybody's a harm reductionist now, the actual orientation is not necessarily harm reduction oriented, because people will say safer injection sites, that's condoning drug use. Just say no. Right. So we have to change that attitude. And along with that attitude, the laws and policies I mean, it was a bit of a heartbreak, right, in Philadelphia, where it became very close, but that not in my backyard NIMBY kind of attitude that we study in environmental justice movements. We also see that in harm reduction movements. Now, a state like Oregon, which is resembling Portugal more and more, so for a long time, the legal infrastructure was such that states and localities could not experiment with different ways of doing things. And if they did, right, methadone, the DEA, which is the, heir to the FBN that I was talking about earlier, that was methadone was illegal, right? So unless you had an experimental, basically license. So there are all these licensing laws, and there are all these geographic restrictions. There are all of these popular referenda, right? So all of that work, which generally falls to activists in this country, remains to be done. And until that work is done, there won't be safer injection sites or safe consumption rooms, or, so some places have them, and they have them like the old needle exchanges that were quasi-legal. And if they have gotten law enforcement to turn their backs and agree that this is a way to go, which happens in some places. But look, there are a lot of places in this country where that's not going to happen because of the attitudes that Adam was talking about.
Well, it's also, I mean, that's how needle exchanges work in the majority of counties all over our country, is that it's still illegal, but they're looking the other way to allow them to happen. I mean, right now, our needle exchange in our area is legal within the city limits. Well, it's not legal, it's accepted within the city limits of York. But if those folks drive outside the city, which is a 2-minute drive, and they get pulled over, all the things that are in their car is now contraband. So they could be, so it's also, like, one thing I will say is, I mean, like the safe injection site in the Gabe Armate gets credit for, started in Vancouver, really wasn't started by him. It was the drug use union of active drug users who pushed that to happen. But like you said, having him attached to it gave it more of a sense of legitimacy, but really it was the street level activists that made that happen in that area. But I will say that I talked to somebody recently that was just up there in that area. And the one thing that I think is going to be so difficult for us to accept, in the United States, is if we get Safe House open, which we need to do, the fact of the matter is there's going to be a very large open air drug market in and around Safe House, just like there is in and around the Safe House in Vancouver, which has to be just accepted as what's going to happen to be able to help people the best way. I feel like the stigma is so overwhelming. I mean, I want it to happen tomorrow, but my heart sinks because I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, just to reference a question that was asked, but we probably won't get to, but our friend and colleague, Nancy Lee Claiborne Nelson, Dr. Lee Claiborne Nelson, now he's a doctor. He had said that the stigma of ODs reminded him of suicides. And we know that Lee has looked at the way deaths are recorded in birth certificates and whatnot, that's his specific genre. And particularly the underreporting with suicides and protecting family members from social stigma. And while with suicides, and I think Lee makes a really good point that it comes from the church in a lot of ways, that it emanates from the church. He wanted to know where you saw OD stigma emanating from. And I think Charlie touched on this of like, it's us, it's our attitude, it's our collective attitude as a society. I think there's a class thing going on there too, when we look at that minorities are clearly affected the most. But I mean, where's this coming?
Yeah. I mean, it's also sad to say medicine. I mean, the doctors who become addiction medicine specialists, they are people who, for whatever reason, don't carry, right, this kind of stigma on. But a lot of doctors avoid addicts, I mean, that's what propelled me into this, actually. My dad and grandfather were both small town doctors together. And the way that they talked about drug addiction was very striking. And even, this is back in the 70s. And so I think that medicine is changing. There's increasing medical education that aims toward destigmatization. But I think that is a really important place from which it emanates that we have to address. And I think it is being addressed, but I don't think it's being addressed enough. And I also think, this business of first responders carrying naloxone, right? A lot of harm reduction activists had a lot of difficulty working with the police. Suddenly, they're drug users and they're being asked to educate first responders about how to use naloxone and what to do in the case of overdose. And so, police, firefighters, etc. And so that has also created, though, these conversations and media kind of events like the stuff around the Narcan parties. And so I do think that stigma, multiple paths, comes from multiple places, multiple professions, but that we do have to acknowledge that, it really does come from us, right? It really does come from within our families. I have medical people in my family, and I hear it. I hear it. It's not. I have a person in my family who once said, why this harm reduction, this naloxone stuff, why not just let them die? That is not gone, right? That attitude is still with us. And so I do think that who lives and who dies question, right, is what we really have to think about. The morality of that, the politics of that, the ethics of that.
Well, thank you so very much, Nancy. I'm going to give a little spiel about what's coming up next Tuesday, not Thursday, but this upcoming Tuesday, November 24th at 7 p.m. We will watch Chapter 4 from A Shadow That Broke the Light. Then we will be joined by Ed Baker. Ed is a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor with over 30 years of experience working with people with substance abuse, substance use disorders, and their families and their communities. He's an educator and student of addiction and recovery. Ed continuously strives to contribute to the eventual elimination of what we've been talking about a lot tonight, stigma. And he himself has been in recovery for 35 years. To reserve a spot for this conversation and Chapter 4, you can go to simpaticotheater.org. You'll also see it on Simpatico's Facebook and Instagram. You'll also see it on Troy Foundry Theater's Facebook and Instagram. You will receive an email once you register within 24 hours of the event with a Zoom link and instructions to log into the event. Thank you all so very much for attending tonight's event. We hope to see you Tuesday. Thank you, Emily Curo. Thank you, Adam Del Marcel. Thank you, Allison Heichman. Thank you, Charlie Del Marcel. And especially thank you, Nancy, for such a compelling and sobering contextualization of this epidemic. Please check out Nancy's book, OD, Naloxone, and the Politics of Overdose. I know you can find that on Amazon. Context matters, and I urge you all to check out Nancy's work. Thank you all so much for coming.